Louisiana, 1863. The air itself seemed to rot with heat and grief. The war had split the state like an old wound that refused to close, and even the cicadas seemed to drone in mourning. Down by the bayou, past fields where cane once shimmered like gold, stood the last remnant of a family that had forgotten how to live. The house loomed in silence, its white paint blistered and its windows staring blankly toward the river. No laughter, no children, only the low hum of a place that remembered better days and refused to let them go. He had built that house decades before, back when he was a man of standing and the land obeyed his hand. People once bowed their heads when he passed. They called him Mr. Harlan with respect that bordered on reverence, but reverence dries up fast when fortune falls. The war had taken his sons, one to the mud of Vicksburg and another to fever in a trench that swallowed names before bodies cooled. His wife had followed soon after, her lungs weakening under years of damp air and grief. The plantation emptied until only ghosts remained, some breathing, most not. The old man lived alone for years in that hollow house, watching his world fade like paint in the sun. He spent his mornings walking the veranda, cane tapping against warped boards, staring into fields that refused to bloom. Every inch of the land whispered the same truth. The old world was dying, and he was dying with it. Then came the letter that changed everything, a letter carried by a boy on horseback, sealed with the faint mark of a family crest nearly forgotten. It told of a granddaughter, orphaned by the war, the child of the son who had fallen too young to know peace. The girl had no home left, no kin except for him. She arrived in late summer, when the bayou was heavy with the scent of wet earth and magnolia. Barely 13, thin as a reed, eyes too large for her face, she stepped from the carriage as though the world might shatter beneath her feet. The old man watched from the porch, feeling something stir inside him that he thought long dead, not warmth, not quite, but the fragile pulse of belonging. For the first time in years, the house had someone else to breathe within its walls. She filled it with movement. Her laughter, rare but bright, seemed to catch in the high ceilings and drift through the corridors like music that had been missing from the air. She tended to the garden, coaxing small green shoots from soil he had long abandoned. She read aloud from her father's worn books, her voice steady, though she often stumbled over the words. She reminded him of the past, of his wife in her youth, of his sons before the war turned them to dust. And in that remembering, something dangerous began to take root. A quiet hunger for what could never be reclaimed. The villagers noticed his revival. They whispered that the old Harlan place no longer looked so abandoned. Some said the old man had found religion, others that he'd gone mad. But the truth was more subtle, more insidious. The presence of the girl had turned the decay of the estate into something almost sacred to him. He began to restore the house, repairing the roof, painting the walls, setting new flowers along the porch rails. Each brushstroke was an attempt to hold on to life, to resist the slow rot that time demanded. Nights grew long and humid. He would sit by the fire, the girl asleep upstairs, and listen to the creak of the old timbers. Sometimes he imagined footsteps that were not there, voices whispering from the hallways. The dead did not leave that place. They merely shifted in the corners, watching him try to build warmth from ashes. As months passed, his affection deepened into something that frightened him. When she smiled, he felt a tremor of joy that seemed to mock his years. When she wept, he felt fury at the world for its cruelty. He told himself he was merely protecting her, that love could still be pure even when it burned too bright. But deep within, he sensed the line he was approaching, the invisible edge between care and corruption. The girl, unaware of the shadows forming around her, grew into her place like a vine clinging to old stone. She spoke of her father often, asked what he had been like as a boy. The old man answered in soft tones, weaving memories that hurt to recall. Sometimes he would find her asleep in the parlor, sunlight spilling across her face, and he would feel the ache of time itself, how everything beautiful came too late and left too soon. One evening, a storm rose from the gulf, tearing through the trees with a roar that shook the windows. Lightning lit the house in flashes, and for a moment he saw her in the doorway, candle trembling in her hand. She was frightened, the house groaning around them like a wounded animal. He led her to the hearth, the fire's glow painting her face in golden shadow. The thunder rolled endlessly, but in that moment, the silence between them was heavier than the storm. After that night, something shifted. He began to watch her more closely, noticing the way her voice had deepened, how her movements carried a grace that unsettled him. She would sing softly while sweeping the floors, and the sound would echo through him like a memory he wished to forget. The old man knew the neighbors would never understand the tenderness he felt. They would twist it, stain it, as all things get stained when seen through another's eyes. Yet isolation has a way of bending the mind. With no one left to speak sense, emotion becomes its own scripture. In that house, surrounded by ghosts, he convinced himself that the rules of the world no longer applied. The war had taken his name, his wealth, his bloodline. What remained was the two of them, and in his fevered reasoning that was enough to justify anything. The servants, few as they were, began to leave one by one. They claimed the place was cursed, that at night they heard voices calling from the marsh. He let them go. He did not need witnesses. The girl stayed, unaware or unwilling to see the change overtaking him. Perhaps she felt pity, or perhaps loneliness bound her as tightly as it did him. Either way, they became the only two souls in a house thick with silence. Autumn came, and with it a sense of decay that seemed to mirror his mind. Leaves fell across the veranda like fragments of burnt paper. He found himself sitting closer to her at supper, speaking softer, as though afraid to break the fragile world they had made. She would glance at him sometimes with confusion, sensing something unspoken but not yet understanding. Childhood was leaving her, and the space it left behind was filled with a strange unease neither of them could name. He began to dream again. Vivid dreams where the past and present blurred. He would wake in the night convinced that his wife stood in the corner, watching, her eyes hollow with accusation. Other times he dreamed of his sons, their faces lost in smoke. He wondered if this was punishment, if God had turned his face from him long ago. But each morning, when he saw the girl tending the garden or reading by the window, the guilt faded like mist under sunlight. He told himself she was his salvation, not his sin. The townsfolk rarely visited anymore. Rumors spread that the old man had gone soft in the head. Some claimed he'd seen ghosts walking the property. Others whispered that the girl wasn't his granddaughter at all. The local preacher rode out once, urging him to return to church, to rejoin the community, but the old man met him on the porch and turned him away with quiet resolve. The preacher left unsettled, muttering that the Harlan place was beyond redemption. Winter crept in slow and mean that year. Frost touched the windows in pale veins, and the bayou grew still beneath thin ice. The girl kept the fire burning, her small hands chapped from work. The old man spent his evenings watching her from the rocking chair, feeling the world shrink to the space between them. Outside, the country was burning itself alive, battles raging, cities starving, but inside that decaying mansion another war raged. Silent and invisible, he began to write letters to no one, pages filled with confessions he never meant to send. He wrote of loss, of love twisted by loneliness, of the way grief could wear the mask of devotion. He hid those letters in his desk, locked away like a secret too dangerous to speak aloud. The house, once grand and proud, now seemed to lean inward. its halls narrowing as though it conspired to keep them both trapped inside its memory. By spring, the girl was nearly grown. Her face carried the shadow of the woman she would become, and that truth unsettled him more than he could bear. The bond that had once felt innocent was now a weight around his neck. He tried to distance himself, spending hours by the river, staring at the slow water and wondering if redemption was still possible. But each evening he returned to find her waiting, eyes bright with worry, and the cycle began again. There were moments of clarity when he saw the madness for what it was. He would recall his wife's voice, stern yet kind, urging him to remember who he had been. But the voice always faded, drowned by the hum of the house and the sweetness of the girl's presence. The forbidden, once unthinkable, began to feel inevitable, as if fate itself were drawing them toward ruin. And so the stage was set, not with malice, not even with desire, but with the slow erosion of reason under the weight of isolation and grief. The bayou kept its secrets well. The neighbors spoke less and less of the Harlan estate, pretending it had sunk into the swamp like so many other relics of the old world. But behind those shuttered windows, a tragedy was taking shape. One born not of passion alone, but of a heart too broken to remember where love should end. By the summer of 1864, the Harlan estate no longer breathed quietly. The bayou pressed close, heavy with vines and rumor. Word had slipped from the servants who had fled the place, carried downriver to the market towns and the pews of Sunday services. Whispers drifted faster than the current. Stories of an old man and the young girl who kept his house, of curtains drawn through the day, of a chapel bell rung at odd hours, though no priest was seen crossing the gate. Nobody claimed to know the truth, but each retelling stitched the tale tighter until even strangers could describe the house as if they'd lived inside its shadows. The old man felt the change first in the silence that greeted him when he rode to town. Merchants stopped talking mid-sentence. Men tipped their hats without meeting his eye. The blacksmith refused to take payment directly, setting coins on the anvil and stepping back as though the money burned. He returned home through fields that seemed to recoil from the sun, certain that the world had turned against him, though he could not yet name why. The girl noticed it too. When she walked the edge of the property, children stared from the road and ran when she waved. The milkman left his deliveries at the gate, no longer venturing to the porch. She tried to brush it off, telling herself people feared the house, not her. But the weight of their silence settled over her shoulders like a shroud. Nights grew longer, the air thicker with unspoken things. She began to feel the house watching her instead of protecting her. In town, sermons grew harsher. The preacher who had once pitied the old man now thundered against unnatural unions, against those who mocked the laws of God in hidden places. Parishioners nodded, some out of conviction, others out of fear that silence might brand them complicit. Women crossed themselves when the Harlan name was spoken. The war still raged to the east, but gossip became its own battlefield, fueled by sanctimony and boredom. The old man withdrew completely. He stopped visiting the post office, stopped reading newspapers, stopped allowing anyone past the gate. His world contracted to the size of the decaying house, its hallways lit by flickering lamps and the steady tick of clocks that no longer kept time. He sensed the girl's unease, but could not speak of it without revealing the shame he carried. Instead, he wandered the rooms, touching the furniture as if each object might remind him who he used to be. At night he wrote again, letters to his dead wife, to his sons, to anyone who might absolve him. He confessed not to an act, but to a feeling that had poisoned everything it touched. He described how love, stripped of guidance, could warp into something unrecognizable. The letters filled drawers, then boxes stacked high in the study, until the room itself seemed to whisper his guilt back to him. The girl grew restless. She was nearly a woman now, her childhood burned away by solitude. She longed for the world beyond the swamp, for the laughter of other voices, for a place where her name was not followed by silence. Sometimes she stood at the gate and stared at the distant lights of town, wondering what they said about her. The thought that she might be a figure of shame rather than pity hollowed her from within. One afternoon, a stranger arrived, a deputy from the parish seat, his coat dusty from the road. He carried a letter sealed with the church's crest and left it on the porch without a word. The paper trembled in the old man's hand. It summoned him to appear before the parish council to answer for rumors of moral irregularity concerning his household. He folded the letter neatly and placed it on the mantel, pretending it was nothing. But that night he burned half the letters in his study, their ashes rising like black snow through the chimney. The hearing took place in a small church whose pews smelled of damp wood and suspicion. Men who once shared whiskey with him now sat as judges. They spoke of propriety, of lineage, of sin. They never uttered the word granddaughter, but it hung in the air like smoke. He tried to defend himself with dignity, speaking of guardianship, of duty to blood. Yet every word sounded false against the rhythm of the preacher's voice, declaring that the Harlan name had become a stain. When he returned home, the girl was waiting by the door, eyes wide with dread. She did not need to ask what had been said. The entire bayou seemed to know. Within a week, stones were thrown at the gate. Windows shattered. One night a cross burned at the edge of the property, its flames reflecting in the river like a second sunrise. The girl watched from the veranda, trembling, and for the first time she saw the old man not as protector, but as the cause of every horror that had befallen her. He begged her not to leave, though the plea never left his lips. It was written in the way he hovered near her, in the desperate softness of his voice when he spoke of ordinary things. She answered with silence, packing her few belongings in the dark. The next morning she was gone, her footprints leading down the muddy road toward the parish line. The house felt instantly larger, emptier, as though she had taken the last echo of humanity with her. For months, no one saw either of them in town. Some claimed she had found refuge with distant cousins in Baton Rouge. Others swore she'd joined a convent, seeking to erase her name. The old man remained at the estate, a figure glimpsed through broken shutters, a lamp burning through the night. Travelers avoided the road altogether. The war ended, reconstruction began, and still the Harlan house stood untouched, a monument to disgrace. When officials finally rode out to collect overdue taxes, they found the doors unlatched and dust thick enough to choke on. The study reeked of mildew and smoke. In the center of the desk lay a single envelope addressed to no one, its ink faded to brown. Inside, a few sentences, written in an unsteady hand, spoke of a love that had lost its shape, of a sin born not from desire but from despair. The signature was smudged beyond reading. They buried him behind the house, beside the family plot that had long since sunk into weeds. No sermon was read, no name carved into stone. The girl did not return. The estate passed through auctions and claims until it was left to collapse into the swamp. Only the foundation remained, half swallowed by roots and time. Yet the story did not die. Every generation found it again, whispered it to frighten children or to warn against pride and loneliness. They said that on summer nights, when the air hung heavy with the scent of magnolia, an old man's shadow could be seen pacing the veranda, searching for something he could never name. Others swore a woman's voice sometimes answered from the garden, faint and sorrowful, as if forgiveness lingered just beyond reach. The war had taken thousands, but few deaths seemed to haunt the bayou like that one household's ruin. It became less a history than a caution carved into the region's conscience. People spoke of it not for scandal, but as a lesson in what grief can do when left untended, how devotion without guidance can rot into obsession, how isolation can turn even the righteous blind. Generations later, when the fields were long gone, and the swamp reclaimed the land. Travelers still paused near the bend of the river where the house once stood. They said the air there felt different, colder, as if the earth remembered. Children dared one another to step through the reeds and listen for footsteps on boards that no longer existed. And sometimes, in that moment between dusk and night, a sound would rise from the marsh, the slow creak of a rocking chair, steady and patient, echoing across a century of silence. Years passed and the land forgot their footsteps. But the story never left. The bayou keeps what it wants. Mud covers bones, water swallows fences, but memory clings like moss to the cypress. By the turn of the new century, the Harlan estate was little more than a ruin swallowed by trees. But everyone in the parish still knew the tale. They called it the forbidden marriage, though no church had ever sanctified it, no court ever recorded it. It lived in whispers, passed down with the same careful awe reserved for curses. Children heard it from their elders by the glow of lanterns. They were told never to wander the old road at dusk, for the dead guarded their shame. Hunters claimed they'd seen faint light flickering among the reeds, sometimes a lantern swinging, sometimes the glow of a window that no longer stood. A few swore they'd heard a woman's humming carried across the water, thin as thread, fading before they could place its direction. The living learned to turn away and not question too closely. In Louisiana, some ghosts are best left unnamed. My grandmother used to tell it with a tremor in her voice, as if she'd seen the house herself before it fell. She said her own mother remembered the girl, a quiet creature with a ribbon in her hair, walking through the market one morning before vanishing forever. The old man's name she spoke rarely, as though it carried weight enough to tilt the room. Every generation adds its own color to the telling. But beneath the exaggeration lies a truth too stubborn to die. A man lost to loneliness, a girl trapped by circumstance, and a love that curdled into ruin. By the 1920s, the land was sold to a timber company. Workers cleared the cypress and unearthed the remnants of the foundation. They found fragments of porcelain, iron nails twisted with rust, and what might once have been the edge of a piano key. One man unearthed a rusted lockbox filled with letters. Their ink bled to shadows. The company foreman, superstitious, ordered the box reburied. He claimed he heard whispers when he touched it, though most dismissed it as swamp fever. Still, the crew avoided the site thereafter, moving their camps farther downriver. When the Depression came, the swamp reclaimed everything once more. Only the chimneys remained, two brick teeth jutting from the earth, and even those eventually sank. Locals who ventured near swore they could still smell smoke, as if the house had only just burned. The place drew drifters and wanderers, the kind of souls already half lost, who spoke of dreams too vivid to be coincidence. They'd wake with muddy feet and no memory of how they'd come to the water's edge. By the time highways cut through the parish, the story had grown into legend. Teachers used it as moral warning. Preachers used it as proof that sin leaves stains on land as well as flesh. Yet not all spoke of it with condemnation. Some, especially the old women who remembered hardship, told it softly, as a tragedy rather than a crime. They said the old man's heart had broken before his mind did, that his guilt had been punishment enough. The girl, they said, had carried his shadow all her life, wandering from parish to parish, never staying long enough to be known. Whether she lived to old age or vanished into the marsh, no one could say. I heard the tale for the first time when I was 12, on a night thick with rain. My grandmother's voice was almost lost beneath the thunder, but her eyes were far away, fixed on something only she could see. She said our family used to live not far from the Harlan land, that her own grandfather had worked those fields after the war. He'd claimed the soil never took to planting again, no matter how hard he tried. Crops withered, animals fell ill, and tools broke in men's hands. The ground, he said, remembered. It would not forgive. I didn't believe her then. Stories have a way of sounding smaller under electric light. But years later, when I walked the edge of that forgotten road, I understood. The air was different there, still almost reverent. Trees grew in tight circles where the house once stood, and the earth dipped slightly, as though bowed beneath invisible weight. I felt the urge to whisper without knowing why. The bayou hummed softly, like breath caught between sob and sigh. I've read what records remain. Parish archives mention a man named Harlan, landowner, widower, Confederate veteran. They note his death in 1865 under melancholy circumstances. No mention of a trial, no will, no heir. The census lists a girl of 15 living in the household 2 years prior, relation marked as kin. After that, her name disappears. The silence between those lines speaks louder than any sermon. Historians dismiss it as folklore, Southern Gothic, a story shaped by guilt and superstition. They say tales like this sprouted wherever war left widows and orphans, morality stretched thin by hunger and loss. Maybe they're right, but I've seen what remains of that land, and I know stories do not linger without reason. Some truths survive because they refuse to die quietly. When I tell it now, I try to speak gently. It isn't a tale of monsters, but of people undone by grief. The old man's love was not romantic, nor pure, nor evil in the simple sense. It was the kind of love that grows wild when no one is left to prune it. It mistook possession for comfort, memory for faith. The girl, barely more than a child, became the mirror of everything he'd lost. In her reflection he sought salvation and found only ruin. The world judged them, as it had to, but judgment rarely heals the wound it names. There are lessons buried in that soil. Isolation can twist even gentleness into something unrecognizable. The human heart, starved of company, can confuse need with devotion. And when a community turns its gaze away, pretending not to see the sickness festering in its midst, it too shares the blame. The Harlan house fell not only because of one man's sin, but because no one reached out until it was too late. Some nights, when fog rolls over the water and the frogs fall silent, I imagine the two of them still there, not as lovers or sinners, but as fragments of a story that never found peace. The old man wandering through endless rooms of memory, the girl tending a garden that never blooms. Perhaps they are bound by remorse, or perhaps by forgiveness too deep for words. The bayou is vast enough to hold both. People still drive past that stretch of land, though few stop. The road bends sharply where the river once touched the estate. Travelers sometimes claim their engines stall there, their headlights dim for no reason. The locals shrug. They know the place needs to be respected. Even decay deserves its silence. Every generation that retells the story softens it a little. The scandal fades, leaving only the warning. Beware the loneliness that grows louder than conscience. Beware the comfort that blinds you to the harm it hides. In time, the Harlan name became just another ghost among many. But the feeling remains, a hush that falls whenever the wind carries the scent of magnolia through the swamp. I end the story the way my grandmother always did. She would lower her voice and stare into the dark, as if expecting an answer from somewhere beyond the walls. She'd say that love, when cut off from the world, turns in on itself like a vine choking the tree it clings to. That's what happened there. Not a romance, not a scandal alone, but the slow strangling of two lives by silence and shame. The house may be gone, the river shifted, the names forgotten, but the lesson lingers in the air. Grief left unattended will build its own altar, and sometimes, if the night is still enough, the swamp remembers the prayer that was never finished. A rustle in the reeds, a breath across the water, the faint rhythm of footsteps pacing an invisible porch. Not haunting, not quite forgiveness, just the echo of a story that refuses to be forgotten.